On August the 24th, 2011, at exactly 2:47 p.m, a 2-year-old boy named Yosemite Jr. vanished from a campground in Leodore, Idaho. When he was found 19 hours later by a search and rescue team, he was sitting calmly on a granite ledge 2.8 miles away, a ledge that would have required technical climbing equipment for an adult to reach. The toddler was completely unharmed. His clothes were spotless as if they had just been washed and pressed, and his tiny hiking boots showed no signs of wear, despite allegedly walking through miles of rough terrain. When investigators asked little Dior where he had been, he looked up with his innocent 2-year-old eyes and said, "The nice man in the white coat took me to see the pretty lights in the sky." There were no men in white coats registered at any campground within a 50-mile radius. There were no medical personnel, no scientists, and no researchers in the area that day. But here's what makes this case absolutely impossible to explain rationally. The ledge where Dior was found had been searched by professional teams using helicopters just 8 hours earlier. Multiple searchers with decades of experience had examined that exact location with high-powered binoculars and thermal imaging equipment. The ledge was completely empty, yet somehow a 2-year-old boy had appeared there as if he had just been gently placed by invisible hands. This is just one of over 1,600 people who have disappeared in America's national parks that don't just defy logic. They seem to defy the fundamental laws of physics, time and space itself. Tonight, I'm bringing you 5 missing 411 cases that even the most hardened investigators refuse to discuss publicly. These aren't just disappearances, they're impossibilities wrapped in mysteries, sealed with government classification stamps and buried under mountains of bureaucratic silence. These are cases that have made seasoned park rangers quit their jobs, forced FBI profilers to question their understanding of human behaviour, and driven families to madness as they search for answers that seem to exist beyond the boundaries of our reality. I'm Blighty Nightmares, and for the next hour, I'm going to take you into the darkest corners of America's national park system, where the missing don't just disappear, they're taken, and what's taken them operates by rules that we're only beginning to understand. These are the 5 missing 411 cases that will haunt you forever. Our first case takes us back to simpler times in America, to June the 14th, 1969, in the heart of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, the kind of perfect early summer day that draws millions of families to our national parks every year. The temperature was a comfortable 75 degrees, there wasn't a cloud in the crystal clear blue sky, and a gentle breeze was carrying the sweet scent of mountain laurel through the ancient forest. The Martin family had driven up from Knoxville, Tennessee for what was supposed to be a perfect weekend camping trip. William Martin, age 36, was a construction worker who had spent his entire life in the Tennessee mountains. He knew these trails like the back of his hand, had been hiking in the Smokies since he was a boy himself. His father, Clyde Martin, age 70, was a retired farmer who had fought in World War II and raised 6 children on a small farm in East Tennessee. They were accompanied by Dennis's brother and several other family members, all experienced outdoorsmen who treated the mountains with the respect they deserved. And then there was the 6-year-old Dennis Lloyd Martin, a bright, energetic little boy with sandy brown hair and sparkling blue eyes who absolutely loved being outdoors. Dennis was small for his age and standing just over 3 feet tall, but he was tough as nails and fearless in the way that only 6-year-olds can be. He was wearing a red t-shirt with white trim around the collar and sleeves, lightweight blue jeans, and small hiking boots that his father had brought him specially for the trip. Around his neck, he wore a small whistle that his grandfather had given him, "Just in case you ever get separated from us, son." The family had chosen to spend their afternoon at Spence Field, one of the most popular and safest areas in the entire park. Spence Field is essentially a large, open meadow surrounded by dense forest, sitting at an elevation of about 4,900 feet along the Appalachian Trail. It's the kind of place where families have been having picnics for generations. Wide open spaces where children can run and play while parents keep easy watch from nearby picnic tables. The field is roughly circular, about 300 yards across at its widest point, with clear sight lines in every direction. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon when Dennis decided he wanted to play hide and seek with his father, grandfather and brother. This wasn't unusual. Dennis loved games, loved making people laugh, and hide and seek had become his favourite activity during their summer camping trips. The adults were more than happy to indulge him, setting down their camping chairs and joining in the fun. From their position near the centre of Spence Field, the family could see a group of other children approaching along the Appalachian Trail from the south. Dennis's eyes lit up with mischief as he spotted them walking towards the field. "I'm gonna hide and scare those kids when they walk by," he announced with the kind of excitement that only a 6-year-old can muster. William Martin watched his son run towards a large bush that was positioned between their family and the approaching children. The bush was about 50 yards from where the family was standing, maybe 60 yards at most. It was dense enough to provide good cover for a small boy, but not so thick that an adult couldn't see through it from a certain angle. William smiled and nodded his approval, settling back to watch his son's play unfold. Dennis disappeared behind the bush, and William could hear him giggling softly as he positioned himself for the perfect surprise. The group of children, there were 4 of them, probably between the ages of 8 and 12, continued walking along the trail, chatting and laughing as they approached the field. They were maybe 100 yards away from Dennis's hiding spot when William noticed that the giggling had stopped. The children walked past the bush where Dennis was hiding. William waited for his son to jump out and yell, "Boo!" the way he always did, but nothing happened. The children continued on their way, completely unaware that anyone had been planning to surprise them. "Dennis!" William called out, still smiling, still thinking this was part of the game. "Come on out, son. They're gone now." Silence. William's smile faded as he called again, louder this time. "Dennis, come on out here right now." Still nothing. William started walking towards the bush, his pace quickening with each step. As he got closer, he could see through the branches well enough to tell that no one was hiding there anymore. He reached the bush and pushed the branches aside, expecting to find Dennis crouched down on the other side, maybe having moved to get a better hiding spot. The bush was empty. Dennis was gone. Now, here's where this case becomes absolutely impossible, and I want you to understand exactly why. The bush where Dennis had been hiding was positioned in the middle of an open meadowland. There were no trails leading away from it, no drop-offs or ravines nearby, no thick forest where a child could quickly disappear. From the bush to the edge of the tree line was at least 150 yards of open ground, covered in short grass and scattered wildflowers. A running child would have been visible from the family's position for several minutes as he crossed that open space. But William Martin wasn't the only one watching. Clyde Martin, Dennis's grandfather, had also been keeping an eye on the game. Several other family members were positioned along the field with clear views of the area where Dennis had been hiding. None of them heard footsteps or rustling bushes or any sound that would indicate a small child moving through the area. William began calling Dennis's name at the top of his lungs while he circled the bush, looking for any sign of where his son might have gone. "Dennis! Dennis! Where are you?" His voice echoed across the meadow and into the surrounding forest. Other families in Spence Field heard a commotion and immediately understood that something was wrong. Within minutes, a dozen adults were combing the area, calling Dennis's name and checking every possible hiding spot. By 6 p.m, park rangers had been notified and the first official search teams were on the ground. By nightfall, only 100 people were involved in the search effort, including park service personnel, local volunteers, and family members who had driven in from across Tennessee and North Carolina. They set up a command post at the Cades Cove Visitor Center and began organizing what would become the largest search and rescue operation in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. By Sunday morning, the search had exploded into a massive operation involving resources from multiple states and federal agencies. Over 1,400 people would eventually participate in the search for Dennis Martin, including park rangers, FBI agents, Tennessee National Guard troops, specialized tracking teams, mountain rescue specialists, and thousands of volunteers. They brought in helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras, bloodhounds trained specifically for tracking missing children, and even military personnel with advanced communication equipment. The search teams were thorough beyond anything you can imagine. They divided the entire area into grid sections and searched each one multiple times. They brought in scuba divers to search every creek, pond and water source within a 10-mile radius. They flew helicopters at different altitudes and times a day to account for varying light conditions. They had volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder through the forest, calling Dennis's name every few seconds. But here's where the case becomes truly disturbing. On Sunday morning, professional tracking dogs were brought to the exact spot where Dennis had last been seen. These weren't just any dogs, they were specially trained bloodhounds with years of experience in finding missing children. The handlers gave the dogs pieces of Dennis's clothing to establish his scent, then released them to begin tracking. The dogs showed immediate interest in the area around the bush where Dennis had been hiding. They circled the spot several times, clearly picking up his scent, but then something happened that the handlers had never experienced before. The dogs became acting confused and agitated. They would start following a scent trail, then suddenly stop and whine. They would return to the original spot, circle it again, then try to follow the trail in a completely different direction. The lead dog handler, a man with over 15 years of experience in tracking missing persons, later described the dog's behaviour as impossible. He said it was as if Dennis's scent trail simply ended, about 30 feet from where he had last been seen, not fading gradually the way scent trails normally do, but stopping abruptly as if Dennis had literally vanished into thin air. During the 9-day search, investigators interviewed every person who had been at the Spence Field area on the afternoon of Dennis's disappearance. Most of the statements were routine, families describing their activities, hikers recounting their routes through the park, campers providing alibis for their whereabouts, but several witnesses provided information that the National Park Service had never publicly acknowledged. 3 separate groups of hikers reported seeing what they described as a wild man or feral person in the forests around Spence Field on June the 14th. The descriptions were remarkably consistent, a tall figure covered in dark hair, moving through the trees with unusual speed and agility, avoiding contact with park visitors. One family specifically reported seeing this figure carrying something over his shoulder while moving rapidly through the dense forest that would have been nearly impossible for a normal person to navigate. But here's what makes these witness reports truly significant. When the families tried to provide these statements to the park rangers, they were told that such information was not relevant to the search effort. When they insisted on making formal statements, they were directed to the FBI agents who took their information, but told them not to discuss their sightings with other searchers or with the media. Years later, when families of other missing children tried to access information about Dennis Martin's case, They discovered that his file contained over 1,700 pages of documentation, more paperwork than many murder investigations. But when journalists and researchers filed Freedom of Information Act requests to examine these documents, they were met with unprecedented resistance. Of the 1,700 pages in Dennis Martin's case file, nearly 600 pages had been completely redacted or withheld from public release. The National Park Service has cited ongoing investigation, national security concerns, and privacy protection as the reason for withholding information about a 6-year-old boy who disappeared in 1969. William Martin spent the rest of his life searching for his son. He returned to the Great Smoky Mountains every year until his death in 1985, hiking the trails, talking to visitors, and following up on every possible lead. He hired private investigators, consulted with psychics, and even worked with amateur radio operators to broadcast Dennis' description across the southeast. He never found a single credible clue about what happened to his son. To this day, more than 50 years later, Dennis Martin's disappearance remains completely unexplained. No remains have ever been found. No credible witness has ever reported seeing him after that moment when he disappeared behind the bush. The official case of his disappearance is listed as unknown, and the case technically remains open, though no active investigation has been conducted since the 1970s. But Dennis Martin's case was just the beginning of a pattern that would emerge over the following decades, a pattern of impossible disappearances that would force investigators to question everything they thought they knew about missing persons cases. Our second case takes us from the ancient mountains of Tennessee to the granite wilderness of California's Sierra Nevada range, to one of America's most iconic and well-travelled national parks. It was July 17th, 1981, and Yosemite National Park was experiencing one of its busiest summer seasons on record. The park was filled with families on vacation, experienced backpackers exploring the wilderness areas, and photographers from around the world capturing the stunning beauty of the granite cliffs and alpine lakes that make Yosemite famous. 25-year-old Stacy Arras was exactly the kind of person who belonged in these mountains. She was an accomplished photographer with several years of professional experience, specialising in landscape and nature photography that had been featured in outdoor magazines and gallery shows throughout California. Stacy was also an experienced hiker who had been exploring the Sierra Nevada mountains since she was a teenager. She was in excellent physical condition, stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall, had shoulder-length blonde hair, and was known among friends for her meticulous planning and attention to safety details. This wasn't some casual weekend photographer hoping to get lucky with a few snapshots. Stacy carried professional-grade equipment including a high-end 35mm camera system, multiple lenses, a sturdy tripod, and enough film to document her entire trip. She had studied topographical maps of the area for weeks before her trip, researching optimal lighting conditions, identifying specific compositions she wanted to capture, and planning her route with the precision of a military operation. Stacy was travelling with her father, George Arras, age 52, and their close family friend, George Bahitz, both experienced outdoorsmen who had been hiking in the Sierra Nevada for decades. The elder George was a retired engineer who helped design some of the trail systems in Yosemite during the 1960s. He knew the park's backcountry better than many of the rangers and had personally guided dozens of hiking trips into remote areas that most visitors never see. Their destination was the Sunrise Lakes area, a collection of pristine alpine lakes situated at about 9,400 feet elevation in Yosemite backcountry. It's a spectacular location that offers some of the most breathtaking mountain scenery in North America. Crystal clear lakes reflecting towering granite peaks, ancient glacier valleys carved into impossible shapes, and wilderness that looks almost exactly the same as it did when John Muir first explored these mountains over a century ago. The group had started their backpacking trip 2 days earlier, hiking the trailhead and establishing a base camp near the lower Sunrise Lake. The first day had been perfect. Clear skies, comfortable temperatures, and photography conditions that Stacy described in her journey as absolutely magical. She had taken over 200 photographs during their first day, capturing everything from wide-angle landscape shots to intimate close-ups of alpine wildflowers. Around 1:30 p.m, after they had eaten lunch and organised their gear, Stacy approached her father with her plan for the afternoon photo session. She wanted to hike about 200 yards northeast of their campsite to reach the granite formation she had been studying. It was an easy walk across relatively open terrain, with scattered boulders and low-grown mountain scrubs, but no dense forest or difficult navigation challenges. This is crucial to understand. The area around Sunrise Lakes is high alpine terrain characterized by exposed granite slabs, scattered boulder fields, and sparse vegetation. It's not dense forest where someone could easily become disorientated. From most elevated positions, you could see for miles in every direction. At approximately 2 p.m, Stacy gathered her camera equipment, slung her day pack over her shoulder, and set out towards the granite formation. Her father and George watched her walk away from their campsite, moving confidently across the open ground. She was carrying her professional camera system, a light jacket, water bottles, and some snacks, everything she would need for several hours of photography work. George Arras could see his daughter for the first several minutes of her walk. She was moving at a steady pace, occasionally stopping to examine potential photo opportunities along the way. The terrain was open enough that he could track her progress as she navigated between the granite boulders and approached the rock formation where she planned to set up her equipment. Stacy reached the granite formation at approximately 2:20 p.m. George could see her small figure silhouetted against the rocks as she began unpacking her photography equipment. She spent several minutes setting up her tripod and organising her lenses, moving around the formation to find the optimal shooting position. This was exactly what George had expected. Stacy was known for taking her time to get perfect shots, often spending an hour or more at a single location. George estimated that Stacy would need around 45 minutes to an hour to complete her photography session and return to camp. When 3:30 p.m. arrived, with no sign of Stacy returning, George began to feel slightly concerned. Photographers often lose track of time when they're working in spectacular locations, and Stacy was notorious for becoming completely absorbed in her work. By 4 p.m, however, George's concern was turning into worry. Stacy was always very conscious of time and had never been more than a few minutes late returning from solo photography sessions. At 4:15 p.m, her father and his friend decided to walk out to the granite formation to check on Stacy. They followed the same route she had taken, moving quickly across the familiar terrain. As they approached the rocks where she had been working, they began calling her name, expecting to hear her voice responding from somewhere among the granite slabs. They found Stacy's camera. The camera was sitting on a flat granite surface at the base of the formation, exactly where Stacy had been planning to shoot from. It was positioned carefully as if it had been deliberately placed there rather than dropped or abandoned. Next to the camera was her tripod, also carefully positioned and apparently unused. Her day pack was sitting nearby, with her water bottles and snacks still inside, completely untouched. But Stacy was nowhere to be found. George called her name repeatedly, his voice echoing off the granite walls and across the alpine landscape. There was no sign of a person anywhere in the landscape. When her father examined his daughter's camera, he discovered something that would become central to the mystery of her disappearance. The camera contained a roll of film that Stacy had been working on throughout her trip. The last photograph on the roll showed the exact granite formation where the camera was found, taken from the position where the camera was sitting. It was a wide-angle shot capturing the sweeping view across the Sunrise Lakes that Stacy had been planning to photograph. This created an impossible timeline. Stacy had reached the granite formation, set up her equipment, taken at least one photograph of her intended subject, and then vanished. The camera and tripod weren't abandoned hastily. They were positioned as if she had carefully set them down with the intention of returning to them momentarily. Her father and his friends spent the next 3 hours conducting an intensive search for the area around the granite formation. They checked every possible hiding spot, every crevice between the rocks, every nearby lake or stream where Stacy might have gone to photograph different subjects. They called her name continuously, their voices carrying across the wilderness for miles. As experienced outdoorsmen, they knew exactly how to conduct an effective search, and they covered every square foot of terrain within a half-mile radius of where the camera had been found. When darkness began to fall with no sign of Stacy, George Arras made the difficult decision to hike out to the nearest park ranger station to report his daughter missing. By dawn on July 18th, Yosemite's search and rescue operations were in full swing. The initial response team consisted of 8 highly trained park rangers with decades of experience in the Sierra Nevada wilderness research operations. They were equipped with specialized communication equipment, medical supplies, and technical climbing gear for accessing difficult terrain. The search for Stacy Arras utilized every available resource and technique. Teams on foot covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness terrain, following every possible route she might have taken from the granite formation. On July 21st, professional tracking dogs were brought to the granite formation where Stacy's camera had been found. These were the same types of specially trained bloodhounds that had been used in the Dennis Martin case. The dogs' behaviour was identical to what was observed in the Dennis Martin's case. They showed immediate interest in Stacy's scent around the granite formation, circling the area where her equipment had been found. But when the handlers released them to begin tracking, something impossible happened. The dogs began following a scent trail leading away from the granite formation, moving confidently across the open terrain for approximately 150 yards. In the middle of completely open ground with clear sight lines in every direction, the dogs stopped. They circled a small area of granite slab, whined, and refused to continue tracking. According to the dogs' behaviour, Stacy Arras' scent trail ended at the exact spot, as if she had simply ceased to exist while walking across open ground in broad daylight. The search for Stacy continued for 2 weeks, making it one of the longest and most intensive missing persons operation in Yosemite's history. Despite the massive search effort, investigators found absolutely no trace of Stacy Arras beyond her camera equipment. No footprints, no pieces of torn clothing, no disturbed vegetation, no signs of any kind that she had ever moved away from that granite formation. It was as if she had simply vanished into the alpine air. In normal missing person cases, searchers eventually find some trace evidence, a piece of clothing, footprints, some indication of the route the missing person had taken. In Stacy's case, it was as if she had been transported away from that granite formation without ever touching the ground. George Arras never fully recovered from his daughter's disappearance. He returned to Yosemite every year for the rest of his life, retracing their final trip together and following up on every possible lead. October the 7th, 1999, the Purday River Trail in Colorado's Roosevelt National Forest. 3-year-old Jaryd Atadero was hiking with his Christian singles group, 11 adults who were supposed to be watching the bright, blonde-haired toddler who loved the outdoors. Jaryd was small for his age, but he was an experienced little hiker who had learned basic safety rules from his father. The Purday River Trail was perfect for families, well marked, heavily travelled, with clear sight lines and multiple access points. 2 miles into the hike, the group encountered other hikers coming down the trail. Group leader made a decision that would haunt her forever. She asked these returning hikers to let Jaryd walk ahead with them, thinking the adults would keep an eye on him until the main group caught up. But in the confusion, no one had established clear communication. The returning hikers walked at adult pace, quickly pulling ahead of the 3-year-old. When they reached the parking area, they realised Jaryd was no longer with them. When the main group arrived and found the hikers waiting there without Jaryd, everyone knew something was wrong. The search for Jaryd became one of Colorado's largest missing child operations. Over 1,300 people searched for 18 days using helicopters, thermal imaging and tracking dogs. But here's the impossible part. When bloodhounds picked up Jaryd's scent on the trail, it simply ended in the middle of open ground, as if he had just vanished into thin air. 4 years later, in 2003, climbers found Jaryd's remains on a steep rocky slope at a 10,000 feet elevation, 700 feet higher than where he disappeared and 4 miles away. The location required technical climbing skills that would challenge experienced mountaineers. A 3-year-old could never have reached it alone. When found, Jaryd's hiking boots were placed neatly together. His jacket was folded and positioned carefully on rocks. His clothes showed no signs of extreme wear that would result from climbing impossible terrain. Most disturbing, his remains showed no signs of animal predation despite 4 years in bear and mountain lion country. Dr. Steve Coaster, the nation's leading expert in lost person behaviour, stated that Jaryd's case violated every known pattern of how missing children behave in wilderness environments. 3-year-olds don't go downhill, seek shelter, they don't become expert mountaineers. The official explanation requires believing a toddler became capable of technical climbing that would challenge adults, navigated miles of impossible terrain without damaging his boots, then carefully arranged his own clothing before dying. The alternative explanations are even more disturbing to contemplate, but if a single impossible case challenges reality, our next story involves an entire family that vanished together. October the 8th, 2009, the Sandboys Mountains of Oklahoma. Bobby Jamison, his wife Sherilyn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison set out to look at rural property they wanted to purchase. They carried $32,000 in cash for a potential down payment, but they never came home. The Jamisons were typical middle-class Oklahomans. Bobby, 44, worked in construction. Sherilyn, 40, was a street preacher. Madison was a bright first grader. They weren't risk takers or adventurers, just a family looking to buy land for their dream home. Security cameras at a gas station in Panola, Oklahoma captured their last confirmed stop at 11:30 a.m. The footage showed them appearing normal and relaxed, asking for directions to the property. From there, they drove into increasingly remote mountain roads. 4 days later, searchers found their white pickup truck parked on a dirt mountain road, blocking one lane. The truck was unlocked, keys in the ignition, engine off but in perfect working order. Inside, their IDs, wallets, cell phones, and the untouched $32,000 in cash. Madison's small dog was alive but dehydrated. Here's what makes no sense. Despite intensive examination, investigators found no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no signs the family had ever exited the vehicle. The ground was soft enough that footprints should have been clearly visible, but there were none leading anywhere. The search became one of Oklahoma's largest missing persons operations. Hundreds of volunteers, helicopters with thermal imaging, and tracking dogs combed thousands of acres. The dogs showed the same confused behaviour seen in other missing 411 cases. They would start following a scent trail, then stop and refuse to continue. For 4 years, the family's disappearance remained completely unsolved. No trace, no credible leads, no explanation for how 3 people vanished from a truck without leaving any evidence of their departure. November the 16th, 2013, hunters found human remains identified as the Jamison family, lying side by side in dense forest 3 miles from their truck. But here's the impossible part. The location had been searched multiple times by professional teams during the original operation. After 4 years of exposure, The medical examiner couldn't determine cause of death. No trauma, no bullet wounds, no signs of how they died. The bodies were positioned as if all three had laid down simultaneously and died together, ruling out scenarios where they died at different times from exposure or injury. The most chilling evidence came from Sherilyn's cell phone. The last photo, taken the day they disappeared, showed a grainy figure standing among the trees in the distance, watching their location. No one has ever identified who or what that figure was. The official conclusion, death from unknown causes, explains nothing. How did 3 people vanish from their truck without leaving footprints? Why abandon $32,000 in cash? How did they die simultaneously with no signs of trauma? And how were their bodies missed in a thoroughly searched area for 4 years? But our final case involves something investigators once thought impossible, a missing 411 victim who returned with memories. August the 15th, 2017, Olympic National Forest, Washington State. 28-year-old Kyle Ramirez was an Iraq war veteran and professional wilderness guide who had explored the Pacific Northwest for years. He was hiking alone on the Salt Duck Trail, a route he travelled dozens of times before. Kyle was everything a missing 411 victim typically isn't. A highly trained in wilderness survival, land navigation and emergency procedures. He carried proper gear, had informed friends of his exact route, and was expected back Thursday evening after a 3-day solo trip. When Kyle didn't return as scheduled, park rangers began searching immediately. The Soldic Trail is well marked and heavily travelled, not the type of place where experienced hikers simply vanish. 3 days later, a search team found Kyle, but not where anyone expected. He was sitting calmly beside a mountain stream, approximately 14 miles from his intended route, in terrain that would take expert mountaineers days to reach using technical climbing equipment. When rescuers found Kyle, he appeared to be in perfect health, not dehydrated, not injured, not distressed. His backpack contained all his original food and water, completely untouched. His boots showed no signs of wear from the grueling journey required to reach that location. It was as if he had been transported there without actually travelling. Kyle had no memory of 3 entire days. He remembered starting his hike on the Soldic Trail, then his next clear memory was sitting by the stream when searchers found him. Everything in between was completely blank. During his medical evaluation, doctors discovered something extraordinary. Kyle's blood contained elevated levels of a sedative compound not found naturally in the human body. The concentration suggested he had received a precise, medical-grade dose from an unknown source. Kyle underwent hypnotic regression therapy to recover his lost memories. Under hypnosis, he described being in a grey place where tall figures in white conducted various tests on him. He spoke of being asked questions about Earth's environment and human behaviour patterns. When Kyle emerged from hypnosis, he was visibly shaken and traumatised. He asked the therapist to destroy the recording and refused to discuss the session further. Within a week, Kyle had moved away from Washington State and has never returned to any national park since. Kyle's case was immediately classified by the National Park Service. When journalists requested information under the Freedom of Information Act, they were told that releasing the details would compromise ongoing investigations into similar incidents. Kyle Ramirez represents something that changes everything about missing 411 cases. He's proof that people aren't just disappearing or dying in the wilderness, they're being taken. And whatever is taking them operates with technology and capabilities far beyond normal human understanding. The fact that Kyle's case was instantly classified suggests that federal agencies know far more about missing 411 phenomenon than they're willing to admit publicly. Carl's hypnotic memories and medical procedures and questioning implies an intelligence behind these disappearances, an intelligence with specific interest in human physiology and behaviour. Carl returned with evidence that missing 411 cases aren't random tragedies or unexplained accidents. They're systematic operations conducted by entities with advanced capabilities and specific objectives. And the government's immediate classifications of these cases proves they're aware of what's happening, but have chosen to maintain public silence rather than warn potential victims. Carl Ramirez came back with memories that changed everything we thought we knew about the missing 411.